happened years ago, back when I was still in high school. My parents had gone out of town for a wedding, leaving me home alone. My older brother worked the night shift, so I had the house to myself. At that time, we lived in a blue-collar neighborhood in a city that was starting to go downhill. As a teenager, I wasn't the party type, but I wasn't a recluse either. I was a big guy, had friends, went on dates, but deep down, I enjoyed the rare moments of solitude. This weekend, I was looking forward to my usual routine: play some PlayStation, order pizza, binge-watch Dragon Ball Z, and then fall asleep on the couch next to my dog, Cecil. Cecil, a sweet old beagle, was about as laid back as they come. He never barked much, usually just slept or begged for food. But that night, something was different. Around 1 a.m., I was just finishing my pizza and starting to doze off when I heard a loud bang coming from the back alley. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, noise is a part of living in a city. But Cecil, who had been resting on my lap, suddenly lifted his head, his ears perked. His hair bristled, and that was when I felt a chill run down my spine. A few moments later, I heard another bang, this time louder. Cecil sprang off the couch and bolted straight toward the basement door, barking and growling like I've never seen before. I've owned dogs all my life, but I've never seen him act like this. He was on high alert, like he knew something wasn't right. The banging continued, persistent and harsh. It came from the back basement door, an old, rusted door that was tough to open even with a key. That's when it hit me: someone was trying to break in. Not just casually testing the door, but trying to get in. Now let me give you some context. When you live in a rough neighborhood, you get used to certain sounds. If someone tries to get in and realizes it's locked, they'll usually give up. But if they keep trying, that's a red flag. They want more than your stuff, they want you. I rushed upstairs to grab the baseball bat I kept under my bed. I didn't call the cops. Looking back, that was dumb, but I was a cocky teenager who thought I could handle it. I wasn't going to run, I had to figure this out. As I made my way to the basement, Cecil, who was already ahead of me, bolted down the stairs. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice, "Oh, F," and then the banging stopped. I stayed up the rest of the night, bat in hand, just waiting. When my brother came home the next morning, I told him everything. We went to check the basement door, and when we tried to open it, the whole door fell off its hinges. If Cecil hadn't scared that guy off, who knows what would have happened. Everyone dismisses it, saying it's just a dog doing its job, but when I tell you Cecil was acting like a completely different dog that night, I mean it. He knew something was up. I'll always be thankful to that old beagle. Thanks, pal. A few years ago, my family was staying with my father-in-law while we waited to move into our new house. We had only been there for a few days when this creepy thing happened. I was sleeping on an air mattress in the living room with my 3 kids, ages 10, 5, and 1. The house itself was pretty open, with the kitchen, dining room, and living room all sharing the same space, separated by a counter. The house was surrounded by large windows on every side. My father-in-law had been in the process of building a porch, but that night, the construction wasn't finished yet. We'd all been asleep for a few hours when I woke up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why I was awake, but I felt alert, like something was off. I lay still for a bit, trying to ignore it, when suddenly there was a knock on the front door. It wasn't loud, but it was definitely a knock. I froze. I didn't want to answer the door. It was late, it was cold, and we were all snug under blankets. Plus, this wasn't even my house, so I didn't know who would be knocking at this hour. The knocking grew more persistent, but it never turned into banging. Still, it felt like something wasn't right. Then the tapping started. Someone was tapping on the window right beside the air mattress where my kids and I were sleeping. I was facing away from it, but I could hear the tapping right next to my head. It was unmistakable. I held my breath, barely moving, until the tapping stopped. I heard footsteps outside, moving away from the window and across the porch. There was a distinct sound of someone walking on tin, which is not easy to miss. The next morning, I found out that the only tin on the porch had already been placed as the roof. There were no sheets of tin laying around, which meant whoever was outside would have had to jump up onto the roof and then jump down at the end. That realization still haunts me. To this day, I can't shake the eerie feeling of that night. And just as I'm typing this, An owl outside just let out the most unnerving, strange screech, like it knew exactly what I was remembering. I used to work as a dispatcher for an ambulance service in a small station. We handled all sorts of calls, but the one that still chills me to my core happened with a patient we'll call Susan. She was in her late 70s and had dialysis treatments 3 times a week. We all knew her and her son, David, who was in his late 40s. They were regulars, and Susan's health had been steadily declining. One day, Susan wasn't feeling well, but she insisted on going to her dialysis appointment. During the treatment, she lost consciousness and was rushed to the hospital. The next time her appointment came up, we called the hospital to confirm her release, and they told us she'd likely be discharged that day, though she'd be receiving dialysis in the hospital. The weird part came after. We called David to check on Susan, and he told us she wasn't feeling well, but that she wasn't up for the appointment. We canceled her trip, but the next time we checked, David told us she was back in the hospital. We didn't think much of it, given her condition. This continued for a while. Each time we called, David told us she was in the hospital. Then one day we couldn't reach David. So we sent a crew to pick up Susan for her appointment. When they knocked on the door, David answered, seemingly surprised that we were there. He told them that Susan was still in the hospital, but when the crew pressed him and asked to check on her, something felt wrong. They radioed us immediately, asking us to verify with the hospital. But the hospital had no record of Susan being there. So we called for a welfare check on Susan at her home. The next morning, I received a call from the sheriff's office. The officers had arrived at the house, and when they were let in, they found a grim sight. Susan was sitting on the couch, wrapped in blankets as if watching TV, but she had been dead for 2 weeks. David had been changing her clothes and sitting with her like nothing had happened. It turned out that David had been keeping her body at home, pretending she was still alive. It's a story I can never forget, one that still haunts me to this day. It was the spring of 2018, and I was 19, living in Nebraska. The biggest city in the state was where I grew up, but even though it was the largest, it was still surrounded by endless stretches of cornfields and wheat fields. The city was slowly creeping outward, with large mansions and sprawling estates starting to take root at the edges of town. Those massive properties seemed to be on the verge of swallowing the land whole, but they never quite felt like they belonged. They felt wrong. One of my best friends lived in one of those enormous houses on the edge of town. His family had this sprawling estate right where the city's suburbs were starting to blend with the deep, silent fields. We would hang out there all the time because, honestly, it was the place to be. Tons of space to ride 4x4s, a giant living room to watch sports, and, of course, a hot tub. And while the place was fun, I couldn't shake the feeling that something always felt off about it. The house had this kind of unsettling quietness that hung in the air, especially when the sun went down. I'm not ashamed to admit it, but I've always been terrified of the dark. The kind of fear that crawls under your skin when you're alone, the kind that makes you second-guess every little sound in the stillness. It didn't help that when you left my friend's house and hit the road, you were met with darkness. The winding road to and from his place was lined with thick trees, and on the way, you passed one of the city's largest cemeteries. There were hardly any streetlights and barely any other cars. It was eerie, an endless stretch of road where the only light came from your headlights cutting through the thick darkness, illuminating nothing but the oppressive void around you. I'd always feel this strange, uneasy energy when driving out there, but I brushed it off. I figured it was just me being paranoid, nothing more. But one night, I came face to face with something I couldn't explain. It was a perfect spring evening around 10 p.m. The weather was warm with a light breeze, and I had my windows down, music playing softly. The drive was normal, that strange mixture of quiet isolation and the soft hum of my tires on the road. I came around a curve in the road, and that's when I saw it. A family. Right in the middle of the road, about 50 yards ahead. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt. My headlights cut through the dark and illuminated them, but even then I still couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There was a woman, tall and slim, walking in front, her back to me. Behind her, an average-sized man and a small child, maybe 8 years old with short hair and their face obscured by the darkness. The mother was pushing a stroller. The odd part? No one was talking. No one had a light. The whole scene was eerily quiet, as if they were simply gliding along in the dark, impervious to the world around them. I turned down the music, hoping to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. No voices, no sounds of footsteps, not even the soft rustling of clothing. Just silence. Complete silence. My stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't normal. They were moving slowly like they had all the time in the world, but they weren't acknowledging me. I stopped the car, sitting in the middle of the road, watching them move forward without a single glance in my direction. I waited. Maybe they didn't hear me? But no. They didn't flinch. They didn't move out of the way. It felt like time had stopped. Everything around me went still, as though the universe had frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but the more I tried to rationalize, the more my skin prickled. This wasn't right. Suddenly, without warning, they all stopped walking at the same time. The silence grew heavier. And then, as if on cue, they slowly turned to face my car. I can't explain the terror that washed over me in that instant. Their faces? I didn't even have time to look. I didn't need to. The way they moved, the synchronized turning, their stillness, it was like something out of a nightmare. My heart was pounding, my body frozen, paralyzed by the fear flooding through me. I don't remember the exact moment I threw my car into reverse, but I know it was like my body acted before my mind even had time to process the full horror of the situation. I must have backed up for 20 seconds, my hands shaking uncontrollably on the wheel, before I finally managed to flip the car around, nearly sending myself into the ditch. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just slammed the gas pedal and sped down the road, my heart in my throat. As I tore through the night, I kept glancing into my rearview mirror, half expecting to see them behind me. But there was nothing. Just empty road, black and endless, stretching behind me like a void. I didn't slow down until I reached the main road, where the lights from the city finally broke through the darkness. I kept checking the rearview mirror even as I drove through the busy streets. I never saw them again. When I told my friend about it, he looked at me like I was out of my mind. I had hoped that maybe he'd know something. Maybe it was just some prank or people playing a game in the dark. But no. He said nothing like that had ever happened before. And no matter how many times I told the story to others, I always got one of 3 reactions. People either thought I was making it up, they thought I was crazy, or they would tell me something similar had happened to them. But none of them could explain it. I can't shake it. I keep wondering if I'll ever see that family again, if they were something otherworldly or just some twisted people trying to scare someone. But the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced it was something far worse than just a strange family out for a midnight walk. The stroller. The way they moved in perfect sync. And the silence. I still think about it every time I drive that road at night, and I still haven't figured out what the hell I saw that night. It was either a haunting, a distraction, or something much worse. And I'll never know for sure. Don't miss out. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories that will push the boundaries of what you believe to be real. What do you think might still be lurking in the shadows? Let's find out together.